をガラル図鑑に登場するポケモンに絞ることにしました。
And so what that means for Pokemon Sword and Shield is that players will be able to transfer their Pokemon from Pokemon Home only if they appear in the Galar region Pokedex.
Yo, who the fuck is MattCMG?
No. I like it, cut G.
So, I've never made a video quite like this before. Well, I guess I kind of have, but also I haven't, so shut your mouth. In January of 2020, I released my Internet Idiocracy episode on the Pokemon Sword and Shield controversy. In that video, I discussed many of the criticisms levied against the developers in the lead up to and release of the games. What I never did in that video, however, was that I never even said whether or not I liked the games or if the games were even good, and if I did say that, then I was definitely blinded by the fact that it was like a new Pokemon game. After all, what's even really the point in defending the games and the companies involved if they're not even really worth defending in the first place? I would not have made that video if the games were perfect and the fan base gave the developers the benefit of the doubt, or if the games were unsalvageable garbage and the developers lied with malicious intent, since in those two extremes, the answer would have been pretty clear cut. Either the fans were happy with the new games and the devs had everybody's best interest in mind, or the critics were right, the games are objectively garbage and the devs aren't to be trusted. In either of those two scenarios, I would not have made that video. But, as Generation 5 once told us, things aren't always black and white. Things aren't always Sword and Shield. I'm really a Menace 3 society today, you know what I'm saying? While my Internet Idiocracy episode was more of a meta look at the criticisms against Game Freak, Nintendo, and the Pokemon Company regarding the development and marketing of the games, this video is going to be much more straightforward. Now that Sword and Shield has more or less run its course in the greater Pokemon cycle, I wanted to take a look back at these games in their entirety to answer the question, was it worth it? Were these games worth the money the consumer put into them? Were they worth the time spent defending or complaining about them online? Were they worthy additions to the long Pokemon legacy? All those questions and more will be answered as we take an in-depth look back at Pokemon Sword and Shield. But before we go in depth, there are a few things that I want to make very clear. I'm going to be laying all my biases out here up front so you guys know exactly what you're getting into. So in case you're new here, how you doing? I'm MattCMG. On this channel, we talk about a lot of different topics, but I make it a point to not make a video that other people have made before. That is to say, I will only ever make a video on a certain topic if I feel that I have a unique take on it. For better or for worse, that's how we do things around here. This leads me into bias number one. If you came to this video expecting the same talking points you've seen a million times regurgitated towards you in a slightly different way, then adjust your expectations, because that's not what this video is going to be. I have purposefully avoided watching any in-depth reviews for Pokemon Sword and Shield so that I don't know what other people have said about the game, and that my opinions are completely my own and have not been swayed by anybody else's, at least not in any major way. Any commonalities between this video and others like it are entirely coincidental. Bias number two. I'm a lifelong Pokemon fan. I've been a Pokemon fan since I was 6 years old. I've played almost all the games, seen at least a bit of each anime series, and I even play competitively a little bit, when the meta is not infested by legendaries. I love Pokemon and will always want the best for the franchise. If I'm being honest, they practically own my fucking soul. However, I ain't no shill, alright? So don't think this means that I'm gonna go easy on Sword and Shield. As much as I love Pokemon, I have just as many things to criticize about it. I've even talked about some of these criticisms on the channel before, and I may end up repeating myself when discussing those topics just a little bit, but just know that if any of my criticisms do seem harsh, they are ultimately made with the best interest of the series in mind, not to nitpick or to be an asshole. This video isn't a defense of the games, but it's also not a complete teardown of them either. Bias number three. I believe that context is heavily important. For example, the context in which Generation 1 was made is completely different from the context in which every other generation was made. You know, the context in which Pokemon was made is different from the context in which Mario or Zelda were made. Comparison is completely fine, but don't disregard the context. Now, some of you might be thinking right now, hey dumbass, why are you listing off your biases get to the point, and I have a few answers, so bear with me. The reason I've listed my biases up front like this is 1, so that you know what you're getting into, and 2, so that if I mess up and I say something incredibly biased or it seems like I'm reaching to validate my own opinion, that you guys can call me out on it. I want this retrospective to be as objective as possible, but I'm obviously going to throw in my opinion here and there. When I give my opinion, I'll make sure that you guys know it, but if I say something that sounds objective but doesn't seem that way, call me out on it. I give you full permission to call me a biased hack if I'm being a biased hack. But now that all the do's have been furthered, let's get weird. Let's get wild. Let's get right into the complicated existence of Pokemon Sword and Shield.
King of controversy, I am the worst things until this Presley to do.
Let's take a trip back to 2017. The Nintendo Switch just launched and revolutionized gaming yet again, being the first home console that can also be used as a handheld. At E3 of that same year, CEO of the Pokemon company Tsunekazu Ishihara announced that the next main series Pokemon games would be released on the Nintendo Switch. This came as a surprise to fucking nobody, since the main series Pokemon games had always been on Nintendo's handhelds, but with the Switch serving that purpose this time around, expectations increased dramatically. Fast forward again to May of 2018, where TPCI announces Let's Go Pikachu and Let's Go Eevee, reimaginings of Pokemon Yellow that are kind of in the main series, kind of not, even though they are main series games. Let's get that established. Many fans assumed that this was a spin-off and wouldn't have impacted the development of the new main series games that were confirmed to be in development in this same Nintendo Direct. At the time, fans hoped that by making a smaller scale game like Let's Go, Game Freak would be getting used to the Switch and would serve as a test run for what the next games would be. It wouldn't be until Pokemon Day of 2019 that Pokemon Sword and Shield would be officially announced to much fanfare. For the first few months, nobody really seemed to have any problems with the games, since what little gameplay they did show was clearly not the final build, so people were pretty forgiving on that front. That was until E3 of 2019, where everything came crashing down. As I'm sure you all know, it was here that the Sword and Shield controversy truly began, as I detailed in my Internet Idiocracy video. It was revealed in this interview that not every Pokemon would be in the game due to a slew of different factors, which many fans didn't take too kindly to. This was a breaking point for many Pokemon fans who had already been frustrated with the direction the series had been taking the past few years, and this led to a lot of anger and vitriol towards the yet-to-be-released Sword and Shield, as well as Game Freak themselves. Though this anger came and went depending on the news, it was clear that Dexit was the straw that broke the Camerupt's back, in that it divided the fan base and made people incredibly biased towards Sword and Shield before they were even released. If you ask me, the backlash to these games would not have been nearly as drastic if Dexit weren't a thing. People would still have criticized the games, of course, but they wouldn't have had the same emotional response as they ended up having. That's not to say that there's no rational criticism. You know, I'll be getting to that later, don't you worry. But it was clear that a large amount of the vitriol was emotionally driven, which led to a lot of cherry picking and baseless assumptions that I detailed in my other video. These vitriolic fans further divided the Pokemon fandom, as anyone who came to the defense of the games when they did something right were called Game Freak shills and Pokecucks by the Dexit crowd, while any legitimate criticism of the games were shot down and seen as just hating. Regardless of which side of this debate you're on, it was clear to anyone that Pokemon needed to change. And change it most definitely did, as shortly after the release of Sword and Shield, it was announced that the games would be getting an expansion pass, paid DLC, which is something that the series had never done before, at least not in this way or to this degree. This arguably worsened the divide, especially when combined with all the other bizarre business practices going on at the same time. But before we talk about the fallout, let's actually talk about the game. Let me just set the record straight right here. Nobody plays Pokemon for the story, unless it's like Gen 5. If you were unironically playing Pokemon for the story in any generation other than 5, you were probably playing it for the wrong reasons. Very generic statement incoming. Pokemon has the same story every time. I know some longtime hardcore fans are really gonna disagree with me here, like, oh, but this thing is different and this character has a different motivation from that character. But that's not what I'm talking about. The story of every Pokemon game from the player's perspective is that you travel through the region, collect gym badges with the intent of becoming the champion, and you fight an evil team at some point. Sure, they change things in every generation to spice it up a bit, but it's all to give off the illusion of change. The faces change, the plot stays fundamentally the same. This is a straight up fact. I don't think I'm really saying anything out of the loop here, but I know people are going to disagree with me anyways. Because of this straight up fact, it is my personal preference that I do not care about the story in Pokemon games. However, just because I do not care doesn't mean that other people don't or that the story isn't important. The main story of a Pokemon game is important in the sense that that is what every player is going to experience. But for the casual fans who don't bother with shiny hunting or competitive battling or whatnot, the story is the only thing that they play through. If you want casual fans to enjoy the brief time that they spend playing, then you have to make sure that the story that they're experiencing makes that experience enjoyable. I said experience too many times. I should be shot in the street like an invalid, because that is what I am. Much like every other Pokemon game, game, Sword and Shield starts off with the player character living in a small town in the south of the region with their childhood friend turned eventual rival, in this case, Hop. You're given a starter Pokemon and you're given the goal of becoming the champion. However, unlike other Pokemon games, they do this in a pretty interesting way narratively. Instead of meeting the region's professor by complete chance and getting gifted a Pokemon, instead they have the current champion serve that role. Leon is Galar's undefeated champion and is widely respected in the Galar region, so why would he take interest in some small town schmuck like you? Well, he's actually Hop's older brother, and after a series of events involving Zacian or Zamazenta in the very start of the game, he chooses to sponsor both of you to take on the Galar League. This is all slightly different from past Pokemon games where, you haven't needed sponsors before and you don't meet the champion at the first, but it all serves the same purpose ultimately. However, the differences do matter once you get into the core narrative and the characters, which I will explain shortly. Once you are given your starter Pokemon, you will meet Sonia and Professor Magnolia for a tutorial regarding Dynamaxing and all that kind of stuff, and it's off to the wild area. I'll go more in depth on the wild area in a different section of the video, but for now, all that you need to know is that the wild area's open worldness isn't really relevant to the story. That may be a problem for some of you. To me, I don't really care. You make it to Modestoke for the opening ceremony of the Galar League, which is something that we've never really seen before in the series, and then it's off to your first gym in Turffield. Which brings me to the pacing of this game. It's kinda wonky. I know pacing is one of the most subjective things when it comes to storytelling, so I'm not gonna say that it's like objectively good or bad or anything. It's just weird. For example, in every other generation, the first gym leader's level ranges from around 10 to 14 depending on the game. When you first fight Milo, his Pokemon are levels 19 and 20, which isn't that big of a leap all things considered, but it just feels weird to have your starter already in their second form on the first gym without having to grind. Your party can easily get to like level 25 or something like that in just the tutorial alone, which is like an hour and a half if you're taking your time, which is a little too long for a tutorial. Granted, Pokemon games have always had long tutorials, so make of that what you will. There isn't really a need for grinding anymore due to the permanent EXP share, which doesn't inherently make the game easier, it just makes leveling take less time. Personally, I think it's great that they don't make you grind anymore since it's a process that is rarely ever fun, but I guess the option would have been nice. It's also the first gym battle that kinda loses me here. Right before the ceremony, they introduce you to the wild area, giving you a taste of the freedom that it brings, and then immediately say, no, you're gonna fight the gyms in this order, no freedom for you, fuckhead, and they send you through these very linear routes. The linear routes kind of lead me into one of the biggest problems with the story. It holds your hand too much. With Pokemon being a kid's game, you kind of expect a little bit of hand-holding. I don't mind a little bit of hand-holding in general, but it's done in the least interesting way here. The routes are so linear and they give you so few options on what to do after each gym or each major story beat that your only option is to just go to the next cutscene, and that's kind of cringe if that's not what I wanted to do. It's not like they tell you exactly what to do, it's that they kind of force you to do that thing, if you know what I'm saying. Granted, they do tell you. The routes and even the towns just serve as these linear paths to the next cutscene. Nothing to really explore, nothing to do, and no reason to come back to them. This isn't too big of a problem for me, as I like myself a little bit of linearity every now and again, but a little bit of exploration or something interesting wouldn't kill you. The town of Spikemouth is probably the worst offender in this regard, as it had so much potential to be this really cool area with its grimy city aesthetic with graffiti and other stuff like that, but all the town is just a path to the gym leader, just a linear hallway. It's massively fucking pathetic. And speaking of linearity, like I mentioned earlier, you have to take on the gyms in a specific order. This doesn't really bother me on its own, but this definitely did not need to be this way. Believe me, I tried to rationalize why Game Freak would have done it this way. Maybe it was necessary for the story, maybe it was a difficulty thing, but no. I genuinely could not think of a good reason for why the gyms needed to be linear. There's no reason for them to be this way, and they clearly know that fans haven't liked linear gyms for a long time, so why even bother doing it this way anymore? But going back to the story itself, you continue through the region collecting badges, and between each badge you usually get some form of exposition or a lore dump, and this isn't actually half bad. You've got two main stories here that eventually converge into one. You've got the stuff you're figuring out with Sonia, who is trying to uncover the secrets of an old Galarian myth about the hero who saved the Galar region on its darkest day. Alongside that, you've got a story with Leon and the man who runs the Pokemon League, Chairman Rose, who has a vision for Galar to have enough energy to last thousands of years, which makes it incredibly obvious that he's the twist villain, and in typical Pokemon villain fashion, he wants to use the power of the legendary Pokemon to make this happen. These two storylines tie together in the end, where you learn that the ancient darkest day was caused by this legendary Pokemon, Eternatus, but was stopped by two more legendary Pokemon, Zacian and Zamazenta, whose triumph was lost to time and relegated to a faulty myth. This isn't that crazy as far as Pokemon stories go, but it's not the worst thing ever like some people would lead you to believe. It's certainly no black and white, but it's definitely not as bare bones as red, blue, and yellow. They are not subtle about the fact that Chairman Rose is the twist villain here. In fact, when I was streaming the game when it first came out, my chat figured out pretty quickly that that he would be the twist villain, and some of them don't even play Pokemon. Rose being the villain also means that his company, Macrocosmos, are the real evil team of this game, which makes Team Yelp seem pretty insignificant and pointless. Pokemon seems like they're in the process of outgrowing the need for evil teams, and Sword and Shield is indicative of this. They give you a team that comes across as evil at first, but you later learn that the people you thought were the good guys were actually the bad guys. They did it in Sun and Moon with Team Skull and the Aether Foundation, and they did it here again with Team Yell and Chairman Rose. Points for trying to switch it up, but 0 points for originality. Team Yell being as pointless as they were, I think points towards Pokemon phasing out evil teams, because let's face it, a good Pokemon story doesn't need an evil team, and the only reason they continue to add them is because of tradition, which is something that seems to hold them back a lot. Game Freak seems like they're starting to realize this, but let's just hope it's not to their detriment. I will talk about all of this a little bit later in the video. Another thing of note here with the story is that the game does not make the player feel like they are impacting the story at all in favor of building up Leon as the ultimate challenge. The most notable example of this is after you defeat Piers and are making your way back to Hammerlock. There's a bunch of NPCs gathered around describing a battle where Leon is protecting the city from a rogue Dynamax Pokemon that is happening as we speak. You don't even get to see the battle. Wonder where that high quality animation budget went there, guys. The scene is great for Leon's character as it helps further build him up as a formidable opponent whilst also showing his righteousness, but as a result it makes the player feel just like the NPCs. You have no agency here, no say in the outcome of this battle. That should be you out there protecting the city like a lot of Pokemon games have done before, but here it's just a very forgettable bunch of dialogue. You go on about your journey and you reach the Pokemon League. This is different from past leagues in that this is actually a tournament reminiscent of the anime instead of the traditional Elite Four that we're used to. Although this tournament is only 4 battles and your rivals serve as the Elite Four, so it's not all that different, it just changes the vibe, and I'll get to that later. Right before you're about to have your long-awaited battle with Leon, the shit hits the fan. This all leads into the climax of the game where Rose reawakens Eternatus, so you, Hop, and Leon have to team up to stop him. And for once in a Pokemon game, we actually have a forced loss. You're not supposed to be able to defeat Eternatus with your regular Pokemon, so they force you to lose. It's then that Zacian and Zamazenta appear and help you and Hop take Eternatus down in a raid battle. You catch Eternatus, Zacian and Zamazenta go back to the Slumbering Weld, and you finally get to have your battle with Leon, after which the credits roll. But the game isn't over quite yet. The post-game in Sword and Shield is actually part of the main game, if that makes any sense. After becoming champion, there is a little 2-hour story where these 2 mysterious weirdos appear, Swordward and Shieldbird, who claim to be descendants of the Galarian hero of legend, despite the player knowing that the box legendaries were the actual heroes. This story is nothing special, just a bit of humorous dialogue and some raid battles with NPCs, but it does result in you getting to capture your box legendary, and it caps off Hop's arc really nicely. This leads me to something that's just as important as the plot itself: the characters. One of the biggest criticisms of Sword and Shield that I've seen is that the characters are flat and boring, but that couldn't be further from the truth. Many of these characters have arcs about self-discovery, and while it's fine if you didn't vibe with those characters, it is completely disingenuous to say that their arcs are bad or that they straight up don't exist, because they very much do. Let's start with Hop. People say that Hop is just a carbon copy of Hau from Sun and Moon, but animation aside, they are completely different, and anyone who actually paid attention will realize this. Hop starts off just as many of the previous friendly rivals in Pokemon. He's chipper and enthusiastic, ready to get stronger, all that generic shit. However, with Hop, they also make it clear that he looks up to his big brother Leon and wants to be just like him. And this hits different when you see how Leon treats you, the player, slightly better than he treats his own brother. All Hop wants at the start is to be the one to finally take down his brother, but after losing to the player time and time again, we see him slowly lose confidence in himself. In each battle, he constantly changes up his team and gets more and more glum to the point where he seems straight up depressed. After losing to you in the league and seeing you be the one to defeat Leon, Hop starts to reassess what his dreams truly are and if they were even right for him in the first place. He realizes that maybe he wasn't meant to follow in his brother's footsteps, but rather to find his own path, which he does end up doing in the postgame, leaving behind his dream of getting stronger to instead be Sonia's assistant as a Pokemon researcher. We see a similar arc with Bede, one of the game's recurring rivals. If you hate friendly rivals and want someone more akin to Blue or Silver, then Bede is your guy. He's a cocky, arrogant dick when you first meet him. And this is because he's being sponsored by Chairman Rose and has been gassed up to high hell for years. He says some nasty things to the player and even plays a role in Hop's arc by being the catalyst for his depression. He's straight up mean. But after an incident where he destroys an important landmark, he is disqualified from the league and he blames the player for it. Later in the game, one of the gym leaders takes a liking to Bede and sees potential in him, so Bede starts training to be the new fairy-type gym leader. He had to learn to humble himself in a way, where his brash, angry outburst got him into this bad situation, so he had to swallow his pride and do whatever it takes to right his wrongs. It doesn't take up too much of the game, but it's still quite an effective arc. Sonia and Leon also get similar arcs that I won't go too in-depth with here, but you guys get the picture at this point. These characters have arcs that, while not necessarily original in the grand scheme of things, have a lot more depth to them than than people give them credit for. While there are certainly characters who didn't have any kind of development despite their prominence, namely Marnie, it's genuinely asinine to say that Sword and Shield's characters had no arcs. The DLCs also add some story content, but not a whole lot. The Isle of Armor's story is pretty disjointed from the main game. It's more of a side story, if anything. It was actually designed to be played at any point in the story, so the story was written in a way where the events of the main story aren't mentioned or don't affect anything. In the Isle of Armor, you come to Mustard's dojo and come into possession of the legendary Pokemon Cub Fu. Though the missions themselves are just a bunch of fetch quests and the main story itself really lacks a purpose, there are still some interesting characters here. Mustard is the previous champion of the Galar region and mentored Leon for a long time, so he serves the role of a wise master with a certain level of goofiness to him. The other main character of Isle of Armor is Clara or Avery, depending on which version of the game you have. I'll be focusing on Clara since I played Shield, and she's honestly a pretty interesting character. She's jealous of the player because you accidentally take her place at the dojo, and even though they let both of you in anyways, she still holds a grudge and makes it clear to you that she wants to take you down. In your final battle with her, she straight up cheats, which is an insanely cool idea that I'm surprised Game Freak did not consider doing sooner to make rivals or villains more devious. She learns her lesson by the end, which puts a cap on the Isle of Armor. Pretty short and insignificant, but not bad by any means. Clara do be kinda fucking vibey though, not gonna lie. She's 18, I think, so I'm allowed to say that. The Crown Tundra has two stories, the first of which is also unrelated to the main story. After getting off the train to the Crown Tundra, you meet with Peony, or Peony, however you say his name, a guy who looks suspiciously like Chairman Rose, and his daughter, Nia. Peony wants to go on adventures with his daughter to search for legendary Pokemon, but she ain't having any of it, so you end up taking her place. On these adventures, you discover the ancient Pokemon Calyrex, a former king whose accomplishments have been lost to time. The story revolves around you helping Calyrex return to his former glory, and to let the people know that he exists again. You help Calyrex regain his full power by reuniting him with his trusty steed, and though the people still aren't aware of the king's return, Calyrex still finds solace knowing that you, the player, still believed in him, allowing you to catch him. Bro, it's like some Minecraft Fallen Kingdom shit. Much like the Isle of Armor, this story is pretty short, and I honestly thought that they'd use the father-daughter relationship between Peony and Nia as a bigger thing, but it's fine for what it is. Then we get to the second part of the story, which is the Galarian Star Tournament. This isn't much of a story as much as it is a different version of what you already did in the league, except with multi-battles this time. Not much story to be discussed here. A lot of people say that the DLCs are selling you the rest of their unfinished game, and while that may hold true in certain aspects, the story is definitely not one of them. Your enjoyment of Sword and Shield's story is not really dependent on what is added in the DLC, since the story was not written with them in mind, and vice versa. Though the DLCs didn't add much, they do recontextualize a bit of what we see in the main story, and the main story itself is not as bad or boring as it's made out to be. Generic and simplistic? Sure, but bad it most certainly is not, especially when compared to other entries in the series that don't have characters with as much depth. Black and White, still kinda the GOATs though. Undisputed champion. While I personally didn't find Sword and Shield's story to be very memorable, and didn't much care for it, there's still a lot to unpack if you actually paid attention to it. I mean, there's a reason I've seen a very large amount of people say things like, I thought the story was bad, and then I played it.
Cause it's Friday, you ain't got no job, and you ain't got shit to do.
So after you've beaten the main story, what is left for you to do in this game? If we're talking just the base game, you've got raids and online battles. That's about it. I do not count fan-made things like shiny hunting or anything like that, since those are just things that fans have artificially created to have fun with the games, not something that Game Freak put in there as an intentional main feature, you know, as like a main selling point. I'm also not including Pokemon camps, since unless you like playing the same minigame over and over again for 0 reward, then that's not exactly a main feature, it is a side feature at best. I'm gonna fill the curry decks, Said no single person ever. Not one person has ever said that, unironically. I guess now is as good a time as any to talk about the wild area, since this game seems to pride itself on the fact that it has this semi-open world. The wild area is really cool when you first get to explore it. It almost feels like Breath of the Wild. Like, I can go anywhere right now, which is a great feeling, especially for a Pokemon game. But after you've biked through it a few times, you've pretty much explored the entire thing and you've seen all there is to see. There is almost nothing to do in the wild area, at least nothing worth your time. There's no point in exploring when you realize how small it actually is, catching Pokemon is only so entertaining, and the bike minigames are genuinely some of the most pointless shit I have ever experienced. It only really exists as a hub for raid battles, and if you're a competitive battler, the only time you'll spend here is breeding. The wild area is a step in the right direction, and the DLCs and Pokemon Legends Arceus are further steps in that same direction, so hopefully Game Freak will take note and improve upon this concept in future games, but as it exists now, there is not much room for praise here. That aside, let's talk battles. There are two ways to battle in Sword and Shield's postgame. You can either challenge the battle tower in Winden and fight endless NPCs, or you can battle other players in casual or ranked battles. Online battles are a given in any generation, so I won't be focusing on them too heavily, so let's focus on the battle tower. Ever since Generation 5, Pokemon games have always had some kind of building where you fight endless battles with NPCs. Sometimes they're challenging, sometimes they're piss easy, and if your win streak is long enough, you might get to fight a special trainer. Now, I'll be honest with you, I did not mind the battle maison and I did not mind the battle tree, because despite being rather shallow, they were still at least a little bit challenging, at least far as I can recall. Sword and Shield's battle tower, on the other hand, is incredibly easy. Anybody with even the slightest bit of battle experience or knowledge about stats are gonna breeze through this. It might be a bit challenging if this is your first Pokemon game and you don't know what you're doing, but that definitely won't make it something fun for players to do long term. The point of a battle facility, especially one in the post game, is to give even the most experienced of players a challenge of some kind. The battle tower doesn't have that. It's just one fixed difficulty and you just rise up the ranks. It doesn't get any harder. If you enjoy mindless battles with no substance to them at all, then I guess the battle tower might be for you. You know, I used to not understand why people wanted the battle frontier from generations 3 and 4 back so badly, but I kind of get it now. I never got too deep into them, but it's clear that they had variety. You know, you had your standard single and double battles, but you also had multi-battles that you could do with friends. And though that was all that existed at the time, they made it more diverse by adding different stipulations to your battles depending on the facility, such as rental Pokemon or giving your Pokemon a handicap of some kind. It made these basic battle formats fresh and new while also being challenging. Sword and Shield's battle tower just has plain old single and double battles, and that can't possibly be fun for anyone long term. Plus, when you consider that the old battle frontiers gave the player a reason to beat them all via frontier symbols, it gave the player something to work towards. It shows immense skill and dedication to say, I got all the frontier symbols, than it is to say, I got Master Ball tier after fighting Leon twice. It's an incredibly shallow battle facility with seemingly its only purpose being to help players rack up battle points so they can get items for online competitive play. This is something that Game Freak seems to have been focusing on in the past few generations, making it incredibly easy to get into online competitive play compared to the previous generations, which is fine and is perfectly understandable, but with that, they're neglecting their casual fans who maybe don't want to play online and just want a fun set of challenges that give them a goal to strive for. One good thing that has come from this focus on competitive play, however, is the other major feature of these games, raid battles. I've complained about raid battles in the past, and I'll get deeper into my criticisms of them in a minute, but I'd like to get the positives of it out of the way first. One thing I really appreciate about raid battles is that they make it easy to get Pokemon with good IVs and hidden abilities that weren't easy to get in previous generations. For instance, I could never have had a competitively viable Alakazam because it is a trade evolution and I have no friends to reliably trade with, so breeding one was never an option for me. Through raid battles, I was able to get one with decent IVs, I fixed it up with hyper training, and bada bing bada boom, I have a Pokemon I never would have been able to use before, ready to battle in a short amount of time. I named them Scrimbim. Raid battles and the Pokemon you can get from them reduce the barrier to entry for competitive play, and I am fully down with that. The problems, however, arise when you actually play the raid battles. These things are incredibly slow and tedious. You start one up, you max the first turn, oh well what's this? Your incredibly powerful max move does no damage because of this stupid fucking shield system. In a raid battle, the enemy Pokemon gains shields when it reaches a certain HP that you have to take out before you can do more damage to the Pokemon. Depending on the Pokemon, these shields can take as little as 3 hits to as many as 5 hits to take out, with max moves taking out 2 shields as opposed to 1. This doesn't sound like it's a bad idea on paper, and I see why they included it. You know, Dynamax Pokemon are big, so you want to give the more frail Pokemon the illusion of being bulky. The problem with this is that they put a cap on how much damage you're allowed to do in between shields. If you use a move that could easily OHKO the opposing Pokemon, then fuck you, you idiot. It's gonna stop doing damage when it hits that shield threshold. I would have preferred if these shields worked like berries do, where when a Pokemon gets below a certain amount of HP, it eats the berry, but it is still capable of being KO'd. The shields are kind of like that, except they stop doing damage right at the exact number of HP needed to trigger it. I don't mind that the shields are there, but the way that they're implemented is restrictive and makes every raid battle extremely tedious, as now you're forced to essentially waste a few turns. This is less of a problem if you're playing cooperatively with other players, since other players can actually do shit unlike these brain-dead NPCs, but that all kind of becomes null and void when you realize that the servers are fucking awful and take forever to load the most basic of commands. I don't know if that's necessarily Game Freak's fault or if it's Nintendo's fault, but it's somebody's fault and I'm pissed. And that's all there is for the base game in terms of content. Like, actually, For real. I'm not exaggerating. These are the only two big post-game features in this game, and I can see why people got real tired of it real quick after launch. Unless you're a competitive player or a shiny hunter, there's nothing for you here. However, that's just the base game. As the DLC adds some more post-game activities, though I will admit they aren't exactly high tier. The Isle of Armor adds, well, it doesn't add much in terms of genuine features. If you want to be really generous, there's the Cram-O-Matic. Y'all remember Kurt from Johto? You know, the guy who makes the apricorn balls? This is him. But worse. Because instead of just getting the thing you want, the Cram-O-Matic adds RNG, every Pokemon player's favorite thing. What? Focus Blast who? Oh, what's that? You wanted a fastball? Well, good luck getting it with the 1% drop rate, you idiot. Oh, it's even worse for these Sport and Safari balls, which have a 0.1% drop rate. Why even bother giving these things the artificial rarity? There is literally no reason for it, just give us the fucking Pokeballs. How much you want to bet the Cram-O-Matic sparked massive gambling addictions in small children? The other feature added in the Isle of Armor is the restricted sparring battle mode, which is a lot like the battle tower, except there are more restrictions on what kind of Pokemon you're allowed to use. It's basically monotype battles, which is a step in the right direction in terms of bringing back interesting battle facilities. However, it's just one mode. There's only so much you can do with it, and much like the battle tower, it's pretty easy if you have even the slightest clue what you're doing. Points for effort, I guess. There's some other odds and ends with this DLC, like the Diglett Hunt side quest that gives you the Alolan forms, some new legendaries and Gigantamax forms, as well as some new moves and returning Pokemon, but ultimately there isn't all that much that they added here that's worth revisiting. But then we get to the Crown Tundra, and ooh boy, this is what the post-game should have been. It is a sizable new area with not only some returning Pokemon, but also new forms of older Pokemon with an emphasis on legendaries. During the main story of the DLC, you'll end up coming across Calyrex and either of his two horses, new Galarian forms of Articuno, Zapdos, and Moltres, and the return of Regipuzzles with two new additions to the family. Alongside that, you'll also stumble across footprints for the Swords of Justice and can obtain the remaining legendary Pokemon through the new Dynamax Adventures feature. The story is kind of the main thing here, and we kind of touched on that already, but it's through the story that you go on these legendary Pokemon hunts reminiscent of the good old days, back when they didn't tell you exactly where to find a special Pokemon and when catching them was actually difficult. It very much has that magical post-game feel that the old games had. The actual main replayable feature here is Dynamax Adventures, which I think is a vast improvement of max raid battles. They don't waste your time with the bullshit shields, but are also challenging because of the rental Pokemon that you were forced to use. On top of that, it allows you to catch every legendary Pokemon that wasn't already in the story, which you can tell was only done for the sake of the competitive scene, because God forbid we have a metagame without fucking legendaries, but the mode itself is fun enough that I don't really mind that. I will say that when you play a bunch of them back to back, it does have a similar tedium that max raid battles have on their own, but it's obviously done because the rewards for it are considered so valuable, so it's understandable. The Crown Tundra also adds the Galarian Star Tournament that I mentioned earlier, which is basically their way of bringing back multi-battles. Much like the monotype battles in the Isle of Armor, this is a step in the right direction for bringing back old battle facilities, but the problem is that they're very limited and very easy. You're essentially just playing the endgame tournament again, but this time with an NPC on your side. The dialogue is kind of the only thing worth playing this for if you care about that kind of thing, but even then it gets very repetitive and there are characters who never even interact, so it also feels like there were some missed opportunities. The battles aren't difficult at all, since by the time you've beaten the game and gone through both the DLCs, you likely already have Pokemon that are a higher level than theirs by a significant amount, and you can sweep them pretty easily. Again, step in the right direction, doesn't stick the landing. Overall, I'd say that Sword and Shield is severely lacking in the content department, and I think that most people would probably agree with that. Even with the DLCs, there is still not a whole lot to do in the post-game, and the stuff that is there is rather shallow. This is kind of fucking pathetic when you look at what past games were able to do at literally less than half the price you'd be paying for the base game and the DLC. The base game had nowhere near $60 worth of content in it, and the extra $30 you'd spend on the DLC doesn't add a whole lot, all things considered. Pricing based on content is kind of arbitrary depending on who you ask, but I still think the point stands here. I would not mind this lack of content if the price wasn't much lower or if the DLC was simply part of the base game originally. And I do understand that these games had a rather troubled development and Game Freak wasn't in control of the price, so I'm a little bit forgiving in that regard, but not by a whole lot. It's still kinda cringe how you're essentially paying more for what is ultimately less. I've said it before on this channel, and I'll say it again, but Sword and Shield's lack of content is going to make it age poorly in the coming years, and I don't see a lot of people revisiting it in the future.
Lucky for you, that's what I like. That's what I like. Lucky for you, that's what I like.
But before we get too fucking mean and I go hard in the paint on these games, let's get some positives out of the way. First up, the Pokemon designs in this game are fantastic. Something that has remained consistent with the series since its inception are the monster designs. Every new Pokemon in this generation is British in some way to reflect the UK-inspired region, and none of them feel out of place or forced. Each design is super memorable, and I've definitely found some new favorites in this bunch, like Dragapult, Cramorant, Graploct, whose name I can never seem to remember, Phalanx, all the starter lines, Eternatus, and Toxtricity. Alongside the new Mons, we also have new Galarian forms of old Pokemon and some new evolutions. I particularly liked how Corsola is dead coral, hence the ghost type, and how Sirfetch'd is a knight. Very memorable designs with a lot of attention to detail hidden within each Pokemon's origin. And speaking of hidden things, Pokemon's lore has always been pretty hidden throughout the games. The main stories will always give you the basics, but if you want to dive deeper into the lore, you can do so through places and NPCs that give you the real details, such as the Canalave Library in Generation 4. If you take the time to talk to every NPC in Sword and Shield, you find out a decent amount about Galar and its history, and this comes into play with the main story involving Zacian and Zamazenta. They are Pokemon that people have seen, but nobody can identify, so their names are in reference to their colors, the cyan and the magenta. The fact that they are Pokemon that nobody can really identify genuinely does make them feel legendary, even if their designs are some of the weakest of this generation. You might be thinking that this has been done before, but surprisingly, having mysterious legendary Pokemon that nobody's seen before has never been done in a main story. This brings me to a larger point regarding the games, and it's the attention to detail here. While the game is lacking graphically, there are tiny things throughout the game that the average player will likely never notice, but show that Game Freak does genuinely care about their world building, contrary to what people might say about them. For example, in each gym there's a little girl who, when you first talk to her, is simply just excited to watch a gym battle, but as you progress through the game, you find that she becomes a fan of you, and is rooting for you in the gym challenge. Team Yell is essentially the same thing for Marnie, which implies that each trainer has fans that are rooting for them, much like we see with real-life sports. Sports and athleticism are a big part of Galar's identity, as the gym challenge is stated to be a yearly thing that happens in the region, and something that pretty much everyone in the region is into. This, of course, is in reference to how soccer / football are huge in the UK, which Galar is obviously based on, but it's much more than just an inspiration. It's a key part of the region and its identity. Galarian culture is based on treating battles as a sporting event, where the gym battles and final tournament take place in these packed stadiums with the crowd constantly chanting and going wild. This is something that makes Galar feel distinct from the other regions in the series, since no other region so far has done anything like this. I would have liked to see this incorporated into the gameplay in some way, like there could have been a crowd meter mechanic where you have to keep the crowd happy and rooting for you or something, but regardless of what could have been, what we got here is something that I've always wanted as a kid. I've always wanted a Pokemon game that feels more like the anime, with these big league tournaments with a crowd and everything. It's just a whole vibe. The DLCs reintroduced the fan favorite aesthetic difference of Pokemon following you, and while they dropped the ball on the tracking where the Pokemon like stop periodically and the walking speeds are all kinds of inconsistent, there's a lot of realism here that you can really appreciate. For instance, Pokemon that fly will follow you over water and water types will swim behind you, while Pokemon without legs or ones that can't move on land move as you'd expect them to. While I think they dropped the ball on implementation, I do appreciate how they tried to make it more realistic. You know, people say that Pokemon has no soul these days, but then ignore when Game Freak does stuff that shows that they genuinely do care, like bringing back old mechanics and putting attention to detail like this in their world. I'll talk about the whole Pokemon has no soul thing later in the video, just so you guys know. Perhaps in future games this will be a permanent thing with rideable Pokemon, or even smaller Pokemon hopping on your shoulder as a reference to the anime like was done in Pokemon Go. It's kinda cringe that it's still only a thing in the DLC. I would have liked an update that puts this in the base game as well, but whatever, fuck it at this point. The character design in general is really nice as well, as almost every major character in the game is memorable for one reason or another, and that's something that you can't exactly say about some generations. Characters like Bee, Alistair, Opal, Leon, Piers, and Milo have very memorable and iconic designs. Milo looks like 5 children formed together like fucking Voltron to make one giant person. It's great. Even the characters that have more basic human-looking designs like Sonia and Raihan make up for that fact with their personalities. Raihan, for example, is constantly taking selfies mid-battle, showing off his cocky, self-absorbed nature. These specific character designs are something that I think only could have been done in 3D, and in that regard, Game Freak took full advantage of that fact. Characters are able to be a lot more expressive in this game, which is a step forward from the blank expressions of X and Y in Sun and Moon, or the expressionless sprites of the 2D games. When it comes down to it though, most of my positives here are relatively minor in the grand scheme of things. Sure, all of these things are great, but most of them aren't doing anything to push the series forward in any major capacity. They're nice, but they pale in comparison to all the mistakes that these games have made. It's like a 1 step forward, 2 steps back kind of situation.
I just keep letting me down, letting me down, letting me down.
I'm not gonna lie. The National Dexers kinda had a point. Sword and Shield are severely lacking in several prominent areas, and that's something that is literally just kind of indisputable. Like, I don't think anybody would really disagree with that. While I still stand by much of what I said in my original Internet Idiocracy episode, the National Dexers are still kind of right, even if their explanations for it are completely wrong. Firstly, let's talk about the lack of Pokemon, the main thing that set everything off to begin with. For whatever reason, Game Freak had to reduce the number of Pokemon available in Sword and Shield. Of the 898 Pokemon currently in existence, only 400 of them were available in the base game, with an additional 110 Mons in Isle of Armor and 74 in the Crown Tundra, as well as 80 more Pokemon that aren't registered in any of Galar's Pokedexes. This leaves a total of 234 Pokemon not coded into the game. While it's not a huge deal, like it doesn't break the game or ruin it or anything, it is still a massive disappointment to not have every Pokemon present, especially when the series prides itself on you being able to catch them all. It's not game ruining or anything, but it's definitely a major slight against the games. Is that an oxymoron? Major slight? I don't know. People were more so upset with the reason for why the Pokemon were cut rather than the fact that they were cut in the first place, since it did seem very scummy for TPCI and Game Freak to say, not every Pokemon will be available, only to add more Pokemon in with updates, with the most convenient ways of getting those Pokemon being behind paywalls. And yeah, that is pretty cringe. Many of Game Freak's statements regarding the cut, though, indicate to me that this was not a decision that they wanted to make. A lot of people also point to balancing the game as a reason to cut the decks, but this is a major misunderstanding. You know, they didn't cut the decks with the intent of balancing the game, they tried to balance the game as a result of the dex cut. Let me put it this way, right? We have to cut some Pokemon, so let's use this as an opportunity to curate which ones make it in so that the game is balanced. People seem to have this backwards for whatever reason, so figured I'd mention it. Based on Sword and Shield's beta that was leaked not that long ago, it kind of confirms my suspicions I had that Sword and Shield had a very troubled development, which is why I'm a bit forgiving on many issues, especially the dex cut, though I'll get into all of this near the end of the video. Like I said before, the dex cut is not the end of the world and is hopefully not a problem that we're going to have to deal with in the future, but it's still pretty cringe that it happened in the first place. I know this one was a big point of contention from the Dexit crowd, so let's talk about graphics, shall we? I'll be honest with you, Pokemon should not have transitioned into 3D. It's obvious why they did, but I'd be lying if I said that every game since X and Y has been pretty hit or miss. X, Y, and ORAS tried to strike a balance between the old 2D sprite style and the more human-looking chibi look, and it came off as very awkward. Sun and Moon's art style made the characters look a lot more human with longer proportions, but they still looked like Pokemon characters, if that makes any sense. You know, I don't know, Sun and Moon just has a weird charm to it. We get to Sword and Shield, and they seem to have gone back a step. The characters in this game have the same proportions as the Sun and Moon characters, but with the chibi art style of Gen 6, and I'll be honest, it's not great, though I guess that's just a matter of preference. I'm not huge on the art style. To me, it makes the characters, specifically the player character, not look like they belong in this world. The gym leaders and side characters are all fine like we talked about before. They look like an evolution of what we saw in Sun and Moon, but the player character has a fucking bulbous baby head, looks like a fucking Progerian. The character designs themselves are fine, like I mentioned before. It's just the art style combined with the general lack of graphical fidelity that makes it come across as super awkward. But whatever, right? Art style is one thing. You know, the art style is not the graphics, but the graphics themselves do leave a lot to be desired. You know, it's Pokemon, so you kind of expect it to be cartoony to a degree. I have no idea what people were expecting when they wanted these photorealistic landscapes and shit, but even in being cartoony, it still looks like shit. The notorious tree is a prime example, but that is a pretty poor one, as there are much better examples, which you're seeing on screen right now, that show some terrible looking textures and errors. Graphics are not the most important thing in a game by any means. You can have a game that looks terrible, but is still great in every other aspect, but they still do matter. I'm forgiving on graphics because it was Game Freak's first attempt at a game of this scale, and we know that Sword and Shield had troubled development, but when Let's Go looks as good as it does, you kinda lose me. The cutscenes are all kinds of fucked as well. These things so desperately needed voice acting, and it almost feels like they were going to add it, but backed out at the last minute. I don't know, man, it just feels weird to have a pre-rendered cutscene in a game and not hear anything come out of the characters' mouths when they speak. The cutscenes themselves look fine. This is probably where the high-quality animations budget went, but voice acting would have added a lot to them. It would have helped you get a better feel for these scenes. As far as performance goes, I'll be blunt on this one, Sword and Shield runs like shit. This game fucking chugs sometimes. Now, it's perfectly reasonable for a Switch game to not run at a perfect 60 frames per second all the time. You know, it's the Switch. We know it's not that powerful of a system. Breath of the Wild, a great game that looks fucking gorgeous, drops frames sometimes too, especially when there's a lot going on the screen. I'm not a huge stickler for performance as long as the frame drops are reasonable, but Sword and Shield has some pretty unreasonable frame drops. Now, you take a game that's not that big in size, that isn't that graphically intense, on a system that can clearly handle much more than the game is putting out, and it's clear that there is a performance problem of some kind. I could understand if the wild area chugs every now and again when there's like a large number of Pokemon on screen, but that doesn't happen all that often, and the game still runs like shit, even outside of the wild area. I have walked into buildings in this game, tiny buildings with tiny rooms, and it still takes upwards of 10 seconds to load that tiny room in when you know for a fact that the Switch is capable of cutting that time in half, at least, for so few assets. I have shaken berry trees that have made the game lag so bad that I thought my TV was in slow motion or some shit. Like, I thought my TV was fucking broken. Even something as simple as picking up an item, something that doesn't require an animation or anything, still takes upwards of 5 seconds to register. When your game is based on exploration in an open world, you want things to be as seamless as possible. So when the game chugs like this, it kinda takes you out of the experience, which is a significant problem if immersion was your main goal. Lastly, for the big negatives, I'm a bit mixed on Dynamax as a mechanic. While I see what they were trying to do, you know, it's meant to be a mix between Megas and Z moves as I detailed in an earlier video, I think it suffers from being overbalanced. While sure, Pokemon get big is a bit generic of an idea, that's not really the problem here. You get 3 turns of increased HP with each move's base power increased alongside some sort of stat change or field effect. It's limited to 3 turns because otherwise the stat changes would become overbearing, but for many Pokemon, 3 turns isn't enough to take advantage of that HP boost. Almost any Pokemon with decent base defensive stats immediately benefits from it, while only a select few all-out attacking mons benefit from the base power boost. It's balanced, but it's too balanced. You know, the idea is to have it benefit every Pokemon, but there are some Pokemon that just can't benefit from it. Like, you're not gonna Dynamax a Whimsicott, you essentially get nothing out of that. I got what they were going for, but they dropped the ball. Overall, I think Sword and Shield's major flaws, while oftentimes overblown, are still valid issues that genuinely hold the game back. No amount of quality of life changes or cute animations are going to circumvent these issues. People are 100% in the right to call out the developers for these issues, because quite frankly, a lot of them are very much inexcusable. So for this penultimate section of the video, I'm gonna go full Pokecuck mode and talk about the common problems that I view as unfair criticisms of the games and explaining why they are unfair. If I talked about it earlier in the video or in an older video, then I'm not going to repeat myself here. These things aren't necessarily positives, which is why this isn't the positive section, because most of the time these things are neutral but are made out to be flaws or faults. One of the most common arguments against not only Sword and Shield, but the Pokemon series as a whole has been that for the past few years, they have been removing features from the games, resulting in these barren games with nothing to do. While I did mention earlier that Sword and Shield specifically do lack fun or interesting content, it's not devoid of content. There is content there, just not quality enough content for people to be satisfied. The content that is there being lackluster is entirely separate from the idea that they are removing content. There are several problems with this sentiment. Firstly, for the content that was removed, that is to say, features that were in one game but not the next, they were excluded for a reason. That reason being, at least partially, to give each region and each game its own identity. For example, part of what makes the Hoenn region is that that's the region where contests are held. It's something that is now synonymous with the region. The Pokeathlon in Heart Gold and Soul Silver never appeared again because it became something that gave Johto part of its identity. People remember it as, oh, that thing they do in Johto. Almost every generation has something like this, whether it be a side event, battle mechanic, or aesthetic change that helps give the region its identity, that helps each game feel unique. You know, the reason we don't see contests in Unova or the Pokeathlon in is because those things don't really belong in those regions. They would conflict with the whole vibe of those regions. They aren't central to the identity of those regions, so they aren't there. The other reason for why this removing features argument is heavily flawed is that there exists a little thing called feature bloat. That is to say, it's possible for there to be too much to do in a game. For comparison, take a look at GTA 5, more specifically GTA Online. Until the Heist update, there wasn't much to do in the online mode. A few updates later, and the game was officially bloated with all kinds of different modes like the biker gangs, the Doomsday Bunker, and the casino updates, which did add some cool stuff, but it was all too much. There's a lot of content in the game now, some of it quite substantial, but now there's too much to do to the point where you can't possibly do everything, and even if you could, it would take an excessive amount of time. Additionally, GTA Online is so filled with shit to do that it becomes overwhelming to new players, and I assume many MMOs face the same issue, where new stuff overshadows old stuff. You know, if Pokemon made every event or feature a permanent addition to the series, you know, we're talking contest, Pokestar Studios, Pokeathlon, Mantine Surf, the Underground, anything you could think of, then Sword and Shield would have had major feature bloat. That's not to say that Sword and Shield had enough content. Like I said before, it's pretty lacking as far as that goes. But not every Pokemon game needs everything in it. Obviously, stuff like character customization, hyper training mints, and other quality of life things like that are things that need to stay because those things only exist to improve the game no matter how much content is in it. This more so applies to the big defining features. The idea that everything needs to accumulate with each installment results in games with too much going on, which is especially a problem for younger and casual fans. It's hard to emphasize the importance and value of your new stuff when all the old stuff is all up in your face and can be easily used as a crutch in case the new stuff doesn't work out. It sounds really cool on paper to have a Pokemon game with everything in it, and something like that is probably possible, but possible doesn't mean that it's practical or that it's a good idea. Moving on to our next argument, let's talk about DLC. As we all know, Pokemon Sword and Shield are the first Pokemon games to have paid DLC in a more traditional sense. With the base game costing $60 and not having as much ado as people would have liked, many fans saw the advent of DLC as a greedy move, intended to milk as much money from the player as possible by forcing them to purchase the remaining content that should have been there in the base game. Many fans began to refer to Game Freak as Game Freak, you know, like the little EA in there. It's on the screen, you can see what I'm talking about, comparing them to EA, a company infamous for its constant nickel and diming of the consumer. I don't think that I need to tell you that this is a stupid comparison, and anyone who unironically believes it's valid needs a reality check. EA's microtransactions and loot boxes are not even remotely comparable to Pokemon offering a one-time payment for 2 new areas with a fair amount of content in them. It's more comparable to like an MMO expansion pack, if anything at all. It's a practice that has been done in the industry for years, and it's a step in the right direction that Pokemon is attempting to modernize in this way. This is infinitely better than their old practice of re-releasing the same game with minor changes, and is significantly more convenient for the player. The only real problem is that it's overpriced, which is totally fair. What isn't fair is claiming this to be a move made out of greed when the only thing that even indicates that is the fact that it costs money. If the DLC was free, everybody would have claimed that it was Game Freak trying to innocently fix Sword and Shield's mistake. But because it costs money, now it's a move made solely out of greed and nothing else. Oh, well, I guess Red Dead Redemption's Undead Nightmare DLC means Rockstar is just being greedy. I guess CD Projekt Red is just filled with avarice for releasing Blood and Wine for The Witcher 3. You're making me pay for completely optional content? What? That's ultimately what it comes down to. People constantly claim that this was Game Freak's way of selling you the rest of their unfinished game, but that implies that the base game itself was unfinished. It is finished, it just doesn't have a lot to do, but that doesn't change the fact that the DLC is entirely optional. If this content was essential, then it would have been free or already included in the base game. If it's not, then it's perfectly reasonable to expect you to pay for it. Maybe not with that specific price tag, but paying for additional optional content is entirely reasonable. One of the biggest pre-release criticisms of Sword and Shield came from the fact that they were clearly reusing the same character models as the last generation, despite one statement claiming otherwise. I already proved in my Internet Idiocracy episode how the remaking the models argument was incorrect and or misunderstood, but even without that one statement from Omori, the goalpost was then moved to now be that reusing the models is a bad thing.
You know what actually pisses me off? Fucking when they reuse assets. Like, are you fucking kidding me with this shit?
That's how y'all sound when you complain about such a common industry practice. As I'll get into shortly, Sword and Shield's troubled development was likely what forced them to do this if they didn't already intend to.
I fucking hate assets.
I hate reuse of assets. All these boxes are kind of different, sure, but they're all pretty much the same.
But look at his hands, they're the same flipped.
Next, there's been a lot of talk over the years about how Pokemon has been getting easier, but I think people often confuse quality of life enhancement for a decrease in difficulty, when those aren't the same thing. Sword and Shield are not inherently easier, they're just more convenient. I mentioned the permanent EXP share earlier, and that's a good example. It doesn't make the game easier, it just streamlines the process and prevents grinding. In fact, Sword and Shield isn't really any easier or harder than any other Pokemon game in my experience. I actually lost a few gym battles in my initial playthrough, and 2 of those losses were because of me reading chat and not paying attention to the game, which I think proves that it's not a spam A to win type game like a lot of people say. If it were, I would have won those battles regardless of if I was paying attention or not. Another part of it is that we collectively as Pokemon fans are a lot more competent than we used to be. When you're a kid, Pokemon games are hard because you're a dumb child, and as an adult, they seem to get easier because you get better at Pokemon. And let's be real, Pokemon in general has never been a difficult series, like at all. Even the games that people claim to be the hardest, like Generations 4 and 5, are still pretty easy. I'd argue that the only Pokemon games that are objectively easier than the rest of the series are X and Y for obvious reasons, but that's not saying much because the rest of the games are quite easy. I offer you a challenge, right? If you have not played Generations 4 and 5 in a while, maybe since you were a kid, go back and play them again as an adult. Because I did, semi-recently, and they weren't that hard. It's also worthy of noting that difficulty, while not entirely subjective, does partially come down to personal experience. What's hard to one person might be easy for another, and vice versa. This transitions quite nicely into the Pokemon refuses to grow up with its audience argument, specifically in the context of difficulty. The reason every game doesn't get progressively harder is because every Pokemon game is somebody's first, and therefore they need to remain relatively easy. With a few exceptions, I can hardly think of any game series that assumes that the player has played all of the previous ones in a gameplay context context and gets progressively harder as a result. Uncharted, for example, is all the same difficulty throughout the series, where 2 is not harder than 1, 3 is not harder than 2, and so on. Mario games have had a pretty stagnant difficulty for decades, yet you don't see anybody complaining about that. Pokemon is really no different in this regard. Of course, the easy solution to this issue that would probably please everybody is to just add difficulty options, and that's a completely valid criticism, but it ultimately comes down to accessibility. Go with the easier option to appeal to the widest range of people. The last thing that I wanted to discuss in this section is the argument that Sword and Shield has no soul, or that Pokemon is soulless now. Quite frankly, it's one of the biggest non-points I've ever seen, mainly because it means absolutely fucking nothing. What specifically is soulless about the games? Is it the shitty graphics? Well, if that's the case, then games like Fire Emblem Three Houses or Deus Ex or half the fucking Star Wars games out there are all soulless because even though they play great, they look terrible. By that logic, it doesn't matter how well a game plays or how much heart and soul were actually put into it. If it's got bad graphics, it's immediately soulless. Well, if it's not the graphics, then is it the difficulty? If a game being easy makes it soulless, then I guess we can call all Kirby games soulless because they're incredibly easy. Or better yet, is every other Pokemon game now soulless because they're all pretty easy too? Oh, okay, right? If it's not the graphics or the difficulty, then just what is it? It seems like people just use soulless as a buzzword but don't even know what they mean by it. What does one define as a game having soul? I would argue that the only actual definition of this would be if the game clearly had love put into it by the developers, then it has soul. But that's something you can't really even measure. You can't measure how much love was put into a game. You know, games like Undertale, Mario, Zelda, The Last of Us, and yes, even Pokemon all have soul because they all have love put into them very clearly. As I detailed earlier, Sword and Shield does have love put into it with a lot of the stuff that I mentioned with the positives, and the game does have its own identity and personality, if that makes any sense. The only way I would ever define a game as soulless is if it's clear that the game was only made as a cash grab. Most of the games that fall into this category are licensed games and shovelware, or games with predatory business practices like loot boxes. I wouldn't even say that being a yearly release makes a game soulless, because even with games like Call of Duty, which have been yearly for over a decade, each installment still has its own charm, and I would say that Pokemon falls under that category. My point here is that when someone calls those games, or any game really, soulless, it's entirely arbitrary what they mean by that. What one person would consider soulless is completely different from what another person would consider soulless, but I think both parties fail to see that every game is the vision of its developers, and to say that their game had no soul when they poured theirs into making it, especially when it's clear that they did, is a tad disrespectful. At the end of the day, while there are perfectly valid criticisms of Sword and Shield like I've detailed throughout this video, a lot of people have made mountains out of molehills with them. Many of these types of arguments don't really prove anything, as many of them are things that are either standard industry practices or things that the Pokemon series has a track record of doing, regardless of if that's a good practice or not. I think it also shows that there is a massive double standard here, where it's either good or bad when Pokemon does it, but not when any other series does. So, after all is said and done, let's circle back to the question that I posed at the beginning of this video. Was it worth it? And to answer that, I'd say that it was and it wasn't, and I'll explain what I mean by that, of course. While the games themselves are serviceable Pokemon games, you know, they aren't the worst ones out there, and they're certainly worthy of being defended to a point, they are indicative of a larger problem that might plague the future of the series. Chances are, you probably already know where I'm going with this. Pokemon is currently suffering from what I like to call Call of Duty syndrome, where the series is dedicated to having a yearly release to the point where it becomes a detriment. We've seen this very thing happen to other series such as Assassin's Creed, where their switch to yearly entries resulted in these terribly rushed games, but when they stopped doing yearly games, the games massively improved. Call of Duty tries to circumvent this by rotating different developers that are always working on a new game so that there can be yearly releases with ample development time for each of them. Pokemon is currently in the midst of their own version of this, where Game Freak is constantly working on multiple mainline games at a time, which requires them to split up their already relatively small development team without much outside help from other developers. Sword and Shield was actually the first time that they've done this, as far as I'm aware. Combine that with the fact that Sword and Shield was Game Freak's first attempt at a game of this caliber, the deadline was non-negotiable, and the aforementioned beta, it's clear to anyone that Sword and Shield had a very troubled development cycle. While stuff like the lack of Battle Frontier and the increased ease of the games are creative decisions made by Game Freak staff, there are many things that were simply out of Game Freak's control, so I don't think that it's fair to blame them for everything when a lot of it was likely the result of corporate meddling from TPCI. You know, TPCI creates the deadlines, TPCI overprices the games, TPCI keeps the GTS and transfers from old generations behind an excessive paywall. These are corporate decisions that TPCI is responsible for. Game Freak has no control over these things, and since they can't really say no, the next best thing they can do is just play along and try to make the best game they can within the parameters given. Be angry about these things, sure, but make sure you're aiming your anger in the right direction. Be mad at TPCI as a company. Singling out Masuda and Omori for just being the faces of the company isn't going to solve anything. Trust me, they know fans are disappointed. The Dex cut is, I think, the most evident example of this. Like I mentioned before, it was clearly not a decision that they wanted to make. They didn't want to make a bad game. They didn't want to cut Pokemon. It was clearly either a development issue or corporate meddling. While there is credence to the idea of the whole selling Pokemon back to you argument, there are a few problems with it. Firstly, never attribute to malice that which can be explained by ignorance. Sure, you could look at this as them intentionally leaving Pokemon out of the game in order to sell them back to you later, and it very well might be that, though there's evidence to suggest otherwise. For instance, the beta for Sword and Shield that leaked a while back that showed Pokemon not in the final game being coded into the early build. This may be proof of them doing exactly that. However, I raise you this. Greninja, a fan favorite Pokemon, one of the most popular, is nowhere to be found in the final game. If they wanted to incentivize people to buy the DLC, wouldn't it make the most sense to put the most popular Pokemon into one of these updates? Plus, these Pokemon are hardly coded into the game when it's a very early build and is clearly nowhere close to done, so obviously something had to have happened between then and now. The beta that was leaked was also from 2018. The game came out in 2019 and was likely finished a few months before release. If this game was in beta that late in development, then it's clear that there was some major crunch going on. And if I have to tell you why crunch is a bad thing in the gaming industry, then I don't think you've been paying attention. But honestly, can you really blame Game Freak for this when they have zero experience making a game like Sword and Shield? If you look at their history, look at all the games that they have developed over the years, you'll notice that they are all these 2D sprite-based games, and quite frankly, they're pretty good at that. It was the transition to 3D in 2013 with X and Y that not only marked where Pokemon started to get worse, but also showed their lack of experience in this regard. Even when the games went 3D, they still developed them as if they were 2D, with X and Y and ORAS still having the traditional grid, showing that they were still thinking in 2D. Sun and Moon was when they seemed to really figure out developing in 3D, where they got rid of the grid and started using these more dynamic camera angles. Game Freak is perfectly capable of developing in 3D like we saw with Sun and Moon and Let's Go, but there they were able to hide their mistakes because it was always a fixed camera angle and they could get away with graphical infidelity on the handhelds. They didn't really have that luxury with Sword and Shield, as now with the Wild Area's free camera, they can't really hide the things you weren't supposed to see, at least not as effectively. And a lot of the graphical stuff that would have passed in the 3DS doesn't on the Switch. A lot of it comes down to a matter of inexperience. They genuinely did not know how to make a game of this caliber. The 3DS entry showed a lack of optimization in many aspects. One particular instance that I can think of is the fact that Sun and Moon was loaded with identical character models for each room a character appears in, instead of having just one universal model. And it's things like this that show that Game Freak's method of coding doesn't translate well to console quality games. This seems to explain why Sword and Shield came out the way that it did, despite Game Freak having more outside help on it than any other game in the franchise. It's because their method of coding is so unorthodox that other companies have no idea how to decipher it. Ultimately, that last part is just speculation, but I think it illustrates another major problem that Game Freak is facing: tradition. A lot of what Game Freak does is entirely dependent on the fact that that's just the way that they've always done it. An example of this is something that I mentioned earlier: evil teams. It seems like the only reason they continue to have evil teams is because it's just a tradition that they've built up, as opposed to something that actually helps the narrative or expands the world building. Another example is remakes. The reason that they started doing remakes in the first place was because there was no way for players to transfer Pokemon from Gens 1 and 2 to Generation 3, so they needed a way for players to have all the Pokemon whilst also updating the old experience. Heart Gold and Soul Silver were also this. It was an updated and improved version of the dated Gen 2 games with the ability to transfer to the new generations. But when you look at Omega Ruby, Alpha Sapphire, or the upcoming Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl, do we really need those? ORAS was a graphical update to the originals and they added some pretty cool stuff, but at the same time, they took shit away, which arguably makes the originals better than the remakes, which kind of defeats the purpose of remaking them in the first place. Diamond and Pearl, well, I guess specifically Platinum, have aged well enough that they didn't need to be remade, but they're remaking them anyways because at this point, they've built up a tradition of doing remakes regardless of if those remakes are even necessary. Granted, they are outsourcing the Diamond and Pearl remake, so that is something. So that happened after I wrote the script for this. It seems as though Game Freak is foregoing innovation or originality in favor of just doing the thing that they always do. And this isn't even assuming that TPCI calls the shots here, which, like I mentioned earlier, is more than likely the case. You know that it's bad when fans can predict your every move before you make it, and honestly, that should not happen. They should be unpredictable. It's actually pretty ironic how the theme of almost every Pokemon game has been of tradition versus innovation, yet Game Freak are slaves to their own traditions, which thereby inhibits their ability to innovate. All of this is why I say that all the bullshit surrounding Sword and Shield was and wasn't worth it. It was worth it in the sense that after seeing Sword and Shield come out as bad as they were, we can now definitively and truly pinpoint what the problem with the series is. It opened a lot of people's eyes to how corporate meddling can really hurt a franchise and how that factors into the development cycle. We know that Sword and Shield are bad when compared to the rest of the series. I think most people would probably agree with that, but we need to take that a step further, right? Like, okay, yeah, the games aren't great, but why did they come out that way? If we can pinpoint exactly what caused the series to decline, then we can solve the problem at its source, which I think what happened here. From what we've seen today, it's clear that Sword and Shield's lackluster quality was most likely the result of corporate meddling, TPCI forcing Game Freak to rush out a game to get holiday sales. I think that all the bullshit, all the controversy was 100% worth it if it means exposing the behind-the-scenes stuff that prevents the series from reaching its fullest potential, as I've analyzed here today. What wasn't worth it, though, were Sword and Shield themselves, funnily enough. You know, if I were doing like a Pokemon game tier list or something, Sword and Shield would be like a high D, low C tier. They're passable Pokemon games. They do exactly what the series needs to do, which is offer a Pokemon RPG experience, but it only does this on the most basic of levels. It doesn't do a whole lot that breaks new ground. You know, sure, they modernized the series with the Wild Area and DLC, but not even those things are done in any meaningful way that truly changes the series. You know, I wrote this before Legends Arceus was revealed, so we'll talk about that in a minute. Sword and Shield are not games worthy of being defended in any major capacity, because they do a whole lot wrong and not too much right. While much of the criticism of Sword and Shield is very much overblown, it is still quite valid in many respects. It was not worth all of the controversy just for it to come out like this. The games are not good, and I will not defend their shitty quality, but I will, however, defend the people responsible who are oftentimes unjustly blamed for things out of their control. Ultimately, we're gonna have to wait and see what the next generation is going to be before we definitively say whether Sword and Shield ruined Pokemon or not. If, even after all of the backlash, the next generation is a step down, then it's likely that Pokemon will never return to its former glory. If the next generation is an improvement over Sword and Shield, then it's clear that they listened to the criticism and they genuinely want to make a better game. The optimist in me really hopes the latter is the case, but Sword and Shield selling as well as it did could very well cause TPCI to double down, and the former may be imminent. Just to mention this, the reason the next generation is the deciding factor and not the remakes is that the remakes typically have a slightly shorter development cycle and rarely make any notable change, as their purpose is to just be the current gen, but in the old region. No other remake so far has made any real significant change like this, so I'm not expecting them to do it this time, with Brilliant Diamond Shining Pearl being as faithful as they are. Pokemon Legends Arceus seems like it's probably closer to what the future of this series will bring, but we'll just have to wait and see if that game is even any good to make any accurate predictions. I will say, that game, graphically speaking, it ain't looking too hot. If it's this close, if it's a year out from release, that's a problem if it's not looking too hot. If we've learned anything from Sword and Shield, it's that you definitely shouldn't base your entire opinion of a game on a first trailer without actually playing it yourself. So if I had to summarize this video, I'd say that Pokemon Sword and Shield are games that genuinely try to push the series forward, but fell flat on execution due to circumstances out of their control. They aren't bad games per se, but they are the bare minimum of what is passably good. They're passable games, not good games, if that makes any sense. Despite that, there are many things in these games that show promise for the future of the series, such as the Wild Area being a step towards an open world, DLC replacing the need for updated versions, and many of the quality of life improvements massively improving competitive play, alongside a story that, while generic, still offers some decent and relatable character arcs that we haven't quite seen in any other Pokemon game so far. However, the lack of meaningful post-game content, performance and graphical issues, incredibly basic map design, and the general rushed nature of the entire game is what truly plagues this generation. And even if these issues were minor, which they really aren't, the games are still haunted by the backdrop of controversy on which they were released, and they will likely never be free of that curse. In fact, I don't think the Pokemon series in general will ever be free of this curse, as we've seen with the Brilliant Diamond Shining Pearl and Pokemon Legends Arceus backlash. The cycle repeats itself, I suppose. Sword and Shield, while they have this negative stigma, aren't the worst games out there, but they aren't good either, and most of it is a result of strict management from TPCI, rather than the common arguments that Game Freak was being lazy or are intentionally making bad games or whatever you might have. Like I said before, the next generation is gonna be the deciding factor, and hopefully we'll be on an upward trend by then. If not, then by Arceus are we fucked. But that has been the Pokemon Sword and Shield retrospective, and if you liked what you saw today, then please be sure to drop a like on this video. Leave a comment down below, let me know what you think, but I don't want to see any fanboy shills or Dexit haters. I only want civil discussion from big brain individuals today. Subscribe to this channel for more long form content like this. You know, I think I'm going to turn these retrospectives into a series. I have some ideas for what I want to do with this, and if you want to help me make that happen, then be sure to support the channel on Patreon to get more stuff like this. I've been MattCMG, and I'll see you next time. Thanks for watching.ねえまだ急いで出かける準備はできたかい？君に見せたい不思議の世界、見送りならいいならいい。たとえ火の中水の中手探りで見えない今日の中、1秒先だってまだ知らないけど、いつも思い出はどれも全部ボールの中に1、2、3で飛び込め、いつか描いた未来が僕のポケットにあるから。初めましてはいつだって初めてさ、ためらうことなどナイストライ Let's have a fight 1バトルはしたなら2笑うか泣いたって3で仲間になろうよ。あの日だってこの日だっていつだってそうしていた。先も見えない果ても知らない世界がそこにあるけど Let's go 転んだする向いて Let's go 何度も歩き出す空に君に決めた